Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Mr. Erik Voorhees about Bitcoin, objections, recent developments, and the future of Bitcoin. Mr. Voorhees is the founder and CEO of Shapeshift.io and a leading Bitcoin entrepreneur. You can follow his work at Shapeshift.io and at moneyandstate.com. You can find him on Twitter at Erik Voorhees. That's ErikVoorhees. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Bitcoin-future. Erik, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining me. So I want to start out real basic just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. I'm sure people have heard about Bitcoin, they've heard about cryptocurrencies, they have a general sense of what these things are. But just to make sure no one's being left in the dust, what is a cryptocurrency to begin with, and why would someone use a cryptocurrency?
So Bitcoin is the world's first cryptocurrency and the largest. There are many at this point, but Bitcoin is still the major player. A cryptocurrency is basically a digital currency that is not controlled by any company or institution or government or bank or anything like that. It's built using open source software and certain cryptographic rules that allow it to be trustworthy. And you can think of it a lot like both a payment system and a currency. So most people are familiar with PayPal, which is a payment system, but it's using the dollar as its currency. So when you send PayPal, you're sending the dollar currency. In Bitcoin, it is both the payment system and it is its own currency unit. So you do not send dollars with Bitcoin. You actually send the Bitcoin currency unit. And the reason it's important and interesting is because it allows any two people on Earth to send value instantly at near zero cost without anyone having any say over it other than the two people involved in the exchange.
So you mentioned under that Bitcoin was the first cryptocurrency. It's also been the most successful cryptocurrency. Why is that? Why has it been so successful compared to its competitors, shall we say?
Well, it had a large head start. Of course, Bitcoin is not the first digital money. There have been a few over the years. But Bitcoin basically had a breakthrough in that its creator figured out a technology called the blockchain, and that's the technology on which Bitcoin is based. And it has attracted at this point, millions of users around the world, about $1 billion in venture capital, and it's been in development for the last 6 years or so. So it's had a long time to develop and grow, and all sorts of infrastructure is being built. My company Shapeshift is one of hundreds of companies around the world involved in building up this industry. And most of the other cryptocurrencies sort of came later or are derivative from Bitcoin, and a lot of them do unique things. They don't all necessarily compete directly with each other, but Bitcoin by far is the lion's share at this point.
All right, now you mentioned the blockchain in there, and I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, what is the blockchain and why does it matter?
So the blockchain is pretty simply just a distributed, decentralized database. So normal databases are held, on one computer or a farm of servers somewhere, and whoever has access and control over that server has access and control over the database itself. And the breakthrough that Bitcoin enabled was to have a database that records, transactions. This account has this much money and sends it to that person who then has that much money. And to have that database be distributed to anyone who's running the Bitcoin software, so that there is no central place where any of the information resides, which means that there's not a person or company who can tamper with it. So that's how you get a trustless financial system without anyone actually being in charge of it. And the blockchain, that's what it is. The way it works is that roughly every transactions on the Bitcoin network are happening constantly, and roughly every 10 minutes a block is created, which is just sort of taking all the transactions of the last 10 minutes, validating them and essentially putting them into what's called a block, and then signing it with a cryptographic message, and then moving on to the next one. And over time, you get roughly every 10 minutes these blocks that go back all the way to the start of when Bitcoin happened, showing where each coin started and all of its journey, where all the accounts it's gone to, all the way up to the present. And so the blockchain runs perpetually forever.
All right, so we'll get into some of the benefits of Bitcoin that we haven't mentioned so far and where Bitcoin is today and where it might be headed. But I want to go back to the founding of Bitcoin. What do we know about the founding of Bitcoin, the reasons behind the founding, and then also the founder of Bitcoin? There's been some, I guess, secrecy surrounding his identity. It seems like that's been revealed recently. What do we know about the very beginnings of Bitcoin and who's behind that?
Well, the very beginnings of Bitcoin probably are best attributed to the mid-90s. And there were a group of people called the cypherpunks, who were basically cryptographic enthusiasts who wanted to use cryptography to build new institutions that were outside of the control of any central party. Obviously, one of the main objectives of such a group would be to make a cryptographic money. And it had been attempted in various ways in the 90s and 2000s, but they all sort of came up short in one way or another. Typically, it was because at some point there was one single point of failure, or it wasn't fully decentralized. And so in, I guess, 2008 or 2009, sort of right in the wake of the financial crisis, a mysterious person named Satoshi Nakamoto, that's what he called himself, released a white paper describing Bitcoin. It's about 10 or 12 pages long, and it describes the mechanism of the blockchain, how the whole thing works. And he submitted it to the cypherpunk mailing list and tried to get feedback on it. Some people were interested. Most people just kind of ignored it. And then he basically built the software over the next year and released it in 2009. That was when the first block in the blockchain happened, called the Genesis block, and it has been growing ever since. The original creator left the project, Satoshi. He left the project in 2010, and to this day, no one knows who he is or really any information about him. There have been a few attempts, many attempts to figure out who he is. There have been a number of candidates, some of whom have claimed to be him and some of whom others have claimed to be Satoshi. None of them are widely believed within the Bitcoin community to actually be the real Satoshi Nakamoto.
Okay, that's interesting because there's been some mainstream press around this Craig Wright from Australia and some suggestions that he may be the real Satoshi. So you're saying that there isn't a lot of validity to that claim, or at least there's not enough evidence to suggest that claim is valid.
No, so there's a very easy way and a clear way that the real Satoshi could prove that he's him, and that is that he could take the cryptographic key that was used in the first block, in the Genesis block, and he could sign a message with that key. Only Satoshi would have that key, and so if we saw a message signed with that key, we would know that was Satoshi. This Craig Wright guy, he's sort of an interesting character. He seems to have been involved in Bitcoin a long time. He's a very smart guy. He has a lot of the credentials that would make him a potential Satoshi candidate. And just, 3 weeks ago, he basically came out and said that he was him. He got the endorsement of a couple leading people in the community who agreed that yes, it was him, and they believed him. And then basically the community was very ready for him to sort of do the ultimate proof and sign that message. And it kind of became a theatrical presentation in which lots of things were said and claimed, but none of the real simple proof was ever given. And then a day after he claimed he would reveal the ultimate proof, he backpedaled and said, I can't handle the pressure. I don't want to deal with this anymore. And he retreated. And a lot of people think he was trying to claim he was Satoshi for some reason. And most of the people, I think, who are experts on the matter are very unconvinced that was actually the guy.
All right, well, he definitely did a very good job of boosting his own profile and name recognition. I for one, had never heard of him before he claimed to be Satoshi, and I'm guessing I'm not alone in that. So kudos to him on that, at least.
Quite a crazy story. Although now I think his reputation is pretty much destroyed because he came out with a claim that he couldn't back up. And the real Satoshi, of course, would know that there is a certain way to do it and a bunch of ways not to do it. And so the whole thing just didn't sit right with people.
Right. So let's get into a little more of how Bitcoin works. So how are Bitcoins created, and what mechanisms are there built into Bitcoin to prevent runaway inflation and the vast expansion of the number of Bitcoins?
Yeah, great questions. So Bitcoins, one of their essential properties is that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins in existence. There cannot mathematically be more than that. Each coin is highly divisible, so to the extent that the coins are very valuable, you can split them up and send pieces of coins around. But there will never be more than 21 million whole units, and they are released every 10 minutes during those blocks, which I mentioned. So right now, 25 new coins are released into the ecosystem every 10 minutes, and it started at 50 coins every 10 minutes when the system began, and every 4 years that rate gets cut in half. So that's why we're at 25 now. Just about a month from now, we will get cut in half again to 12 and a half coins every 10 minutes. And that process continues forever. And if you plot that pattern out on a graph, you'll see that it asymptotically approaches 21 million coins. And that's the limit of the currency supply. So that feature was one of the things which attracted many people to Bitcoin, because unlike every government currency, it is both precisely known how much currency is in existence, how much there will be tomorrow and 10 years from now and 30 years from now, and there's no group or company or anything that can create more of it out of thin air. And that appealed to a lot of people, and that was one of its early attractions.
So a lot of people may have heard the term mining in relation to the creation of new Bitcoins. What is the mining process, and how does that fit into this whole concept?
Yeah, the mining is essentially what creates those blocks. So mining is better probably described as auditing, but essentially you have very high-powered computers all over the world that are watching all the transactions, and they are trying to find the solution to a increasingly difficult math problem. And the first one anywhere in the world that figures it out has the right to create a new block. And so creating a new block grants that miner 25 new Bitcoin right now. So there's a financial, that's worth several $1,000s, like $12,000 right now. So there's an incentive to find those blocks, which means there's an incentive to dedicate processing power to that task. And what that does is it secures the network, because essentially to take over the Bitcoin network, or to change how coins move around, or to interfere with it, you essentially need to have more than half of the mining power in the world. And when Bitcoin got started, obviously that was a small amount, and someone with a super high-powered supercomputer could probably come in and do it. But at this point, the Bitcoin mining network is some crazy power number, like 100,000 times more powerful than all the supercomputers on Earth, kind of thing. So it's become just an astronomical powerhouse of computation dedicated to securing the network.
So if someone is new to Bitcoin, but they've heard about it and they like some of the features, how would they go about using Bitcoins, and how easy is it to use, especially as compared to fiat currency, to Federal Reserve notes?
Yeah, well, I like to describe it often like a car or a computer, where it can be very easy to use, right? There's a little bit of learning that goes on, but once you get the hang of it, a car is easy to drive, a are is relatively easy to use. And you don't need to know much about how the internal combustion engine works or how the circuits of the computer are designed to be able to use it. If you want to, you can dive very deep into the subject and learn all sorts of interesting ways about how it works, but that's not necessary to actually use it. So to use Bitcoin, sort of the best way is to just get a wallet. Bitcoins are held in wallets, either on a computer or on your mobile phone. And so you just download a Bitcoin wallet from the App Store, and then you need to get some Bitcoins. And that's sort of like asking, well, how do I get money? And well, you get money by selling your goods and labor for money, or buying some money. Like if you needed euros, you'd go to a currency exchange and pay with dollars and get some euros. There are Bitcoin exchanges, so you can pay with dollars and get Bitcoin in the same way. And then you would have them on your phone.
All right. Now, one debate that we see playing out relatively frequently is Bitcoin versus gold or silver or some other commodity type of money. Now, people, I guess, who engage in that debate have already assumed that fiat money is not the best kind of money to use. But why does the objection that Bitcoins don't have value in and of themselves, why doesn't that objection hold water? And how would you compare the validity of using Bitcoin to the validity of using gold in the marketplace?
Great questions. So I've long been a advocate of gold as a superior form of money to fiat, and that's true for a number of reasons, but primarily because gold is not created by a central group of people that can manipulate the money supply. And gold has been sort of the best form of money that the world has known forever, since the beginning of money. And when I started looking into Bitcoin, many of the reasons that I got excited about it were because there were so many similarities with gold. So many of the properties of Bitcoin were aligned with gold, and then it had some additional properties that made it even better for day-to-day use. So some of the properties it shares make it good money. For example, divisibility, fungibility, recognizability. You can test to make sure that it's authentic. It has a high value to weight ratio, that kind of thing. And all those properties are found both in gold and Bitcoin. But unlike gold, which is constrained to the physical world, and which is very hard in practice to break apart and recombine and use for daily purchases of coffee, Bitcoin is digital. It can be combined and it can be broken apart and recombined immediately, instantly on your phone. It's easy to buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, and it's easy to send it across the world instantly in any amount. So whether you're sending $1 worth of Bitcoin or $10 million, it's the exact same process, and you can do it in about 10 seconds. If you're trying to send $1 worth of gold across the world, it doesn't even make sense. Like you'd spend more on postage than it would be worth, and it would be too much hassle, so you would never do that. And similarly, sending $10 million worth of gold becomes quite a challenge. You have to be very careful about how you do it. There are all sorts of customs issues, and you're going to pay a lot for security and transport and all that. Bitcoin just moves like an email across any border without any friction whatsoever.
All right. Now, another objection that you'll hear is that the value of Bitcoin fluctuates too frequently and too great, and that sometimes you might get bubbles in Bitcoin. What would you say about the value fluctuations of Bitcoin? All types of money, of course, fluctuate in value, but how does Bitcoin's fluctuations in value differ from the fluctuations in value of other types of money, and is that a valid criticism and objection in any way?
Yeah, so it is true that Bitcoin has been relatively highly volatile since it was created. Back when I got involved, it was typical that Bitcoin would go up or down, 20 or 30% in a single day, which, if you're using it as money, becomes very problematic. Over time, it has stabilized, and this should be expected. Of course, any small asset is going to be more volatile than a larger one that becomes more widely used. You see this in stocks, where small cap stocks typically move with greater volatility than large cap stocks. And it should be expected that a brand new form of money that no one has ever heard about, and which has tons of potential but is also still an experiment and which could fail and go to zero, is going to be very volatile in its early years. No one knows whether it's going to take over finance or whether it's just a silly experiment that's going to go nowhere. And so that should be both expected and understood to be the way that it's going to work in its early years. But as it grows, it starts to achieve stability in the market. And, today, the last few days being an exception because it's been on a little rally over this last week. But, over the last 2 years, it's been fairly stable. It moves, maybe 1 or 2% on an average day, which is less than many stocks, less than some commodities. There have been days when Bitcoin was less volatile than national currencies. So it is achieving stability over time, but that's something that can't be designed or programmed. It has to be earned in the marketplace.
So what is the value of a Bitcoin right now in terms of U.S. dollars? I know that might not be the best way to think about it, but for those of us who are used to dealing in dollars, it can be helpful.
Yeah, so one Bitcoin costs about $530 today. and Bitcoin's obviously started at zero. So they have been, with the exception probably of 2014, which was a very bearish year for Bitcoin, the best performing financial asset over the last half decade by far.
All right. Now, I know it seems like I'm jumping around a lot, but there are so many topics I want to get to related to Bitcoin. So I want to jump back to something that you briefly mentioned earlier in our conversation, where you talked about the anonymity of Bitcoin. Can you discuss just how secret use of Bitcoin is and how anonymous one's use of Bitcoin is, and then whether governments have the ability to access one's Bitcoins the way that they might have the ability to access one's bank account?
Yeah, these are all really good questions and all very interesting topics. Bitcoin is properly described as very private. It is not perfectly anonymous. When you create a Bitcoin account, you don't need to attach any personal information to that. You just create it on your phone or on your computer. And then you have your Bitcoin addresses, which are your account numbers, and you can have as many of those as you want. None of them are tied to your identity. However, if you are not very careful in how you use Bitcoin, you will inevitably leak certain information. And the most obvious case is, while you can make a private Bitcoin address, if you post it on your Facebook page so that someone can send you money, then of course everyone knows that address belongs to you, and henceforth any coins that go to that address can be associated with your identity. On the other hand, if you know what you're doing and you're careful, you can use Bitcoin in a nearly anonymous way, but it takes some work and some effort to maintain that. In any case, Bitcoin is far more private than any traditional bank or PayPal or credit cards or anything like that. One of its greatest virtues is that when you shop with Bitcoin, you're not giving personal private information out to every vendor that you shop with. And this has become, I think, a really big issue in our society, where to buy something online, which more and more commerce is online, every time you use your credit card, your personal information is going to that merchant. And it can be intercepted in transit. The merchant could use it for nefarious purposes. The merchant could accidentally leak it somehow. Hackers could get in and steal that data. This happens all the time to companies large and small, even to governments. And so the fact that people have been leaving all this private information around the world is the cause of massive identity theft and a huge cost to society. You shouldn't have to give up personal information in order to buy something online. In the same way that when you walk into Walmart and buy something with cash, you're not required to give personal information. And I think if Walmart asked for all that for a cash purchase, you would think that was kind of invasive. But for some reason, we accept that with credit cards. So Bitcoin finally brings, a level of financial privacy back to people that I think is very important.
Right, and largely because of the lack of invasive questions that surround use of cash, we've seen governments around the world cracking down on the use of cash, the so-called war on cash, where they're trying to force everyone into the banking system and into a less private form of the use of money, of types of money. So what government crackdowns may we see on Bitcoin as a part of this quote-unquote war on cash, and what government crackdowns have we seen on Bitcoin already? Of course, they tried to crack down on the Liberty Dollar and were largely successful in that. Why have attempts to crack down on Bitcoin in such a way, in a similar way, failed?
So, sort of to answer that last part about Liberty Dollar first, Liberty Dollar was great, but the problem is it has a central point of failure. There is a Liberty Dollar company and a person in charge of the Liberty Dollar, and so if the government gets upset about it, well, they walk into the office and they steal all the stuff and they shut it down. And that was true with eGold several years prior, which was sort of the first widespread used digital money. And Bitcoin does not have that. There's no office that can be raided or no Bitcoin server that can be shut down. The system cannot be turned off by anyone. There's no one in the world, no matter how powerful, that can turn Bitcoin off. The only way that it can stop is if the entire internet shut down, which itself would be impossible. So in that regard, it is very much censorship resistant. It gives financial sovereignty to people who, as you said, are being forced into increasingly surveilled forms of money, all their banks and everything. And so, I think most people most people dislike cash. It's dirty, it's inconvenient, it's expensive to pull out of ATMs. But the one very good and important thing about cash is that it lets you have, some degree of financial privacy, which is very important for any, free and sovereign person in a free country. That's the right that everyone has. And, I expect cash will go away, and I would be much more concerned about that if there were not systems like Bitcoin springing up to take that place.
All right, so you don't think that Bitcoin will be affected by this war on cash, and you don't think we'll see any successful government crackdowns on Bitcoin anytime soon?
There will be enforcement actions against some people and companies. Any individual or company who is breaking the law and the government finds them is likely to be shut down. But the system itself cannot be. And that's the important point. And it's also not a system that's just, American. It is global. Bitcoin operates around the world. There's no restrictions on territories or terms of service or anything like that.
All right. So since you mentioned that Bitcoin is global, how does Bitcoin use in the U.S. compare with Bitcoin use elsewhere, both in terms of how widespread it is and in terms of how easy it is to do? I guess it's probably just as easy to do it from anywhere in the world, but how does the prevalence of use compare?
Yeah, so Bitcoin adoption and usage has largely followed sort of computer and technology adoption. So it's grown mostly in Western countries, in the U.S., Canada, and Europe. That's just sort of the nature of it coming out of technologists who are on computers and on the internet all day. Those are the people who find out about this stuff soonest. However, it is spreading to other places in the world. It's the last 2 years, China has become the actually largest market for Bitcoin exchange. It is getting widespread adoption. Well, starting to get widespread adoption in South American countries like Argentina and Brazil. Venezuela can't happen fast enough as their currency collapses and everyone's savings are being totally wiped out, and that country is going downhill fast. Anyone there who knows about Bitcoin has a way of preserving their family's assets and hopefully surviving. But it's following the path of the internet. Anyone with an internet connected device can learn about and access and use Bitcoin, from a wealthy person in the West to a rural farmer in Africa. If you have a $50 smartphone with a data plan, which is increasingly common even in the poorest areas of the world, you now have access to the global economy.
So how would you compare the popularity and use of Bitcoin now to its popularity a couple years ago? The general sense, I suppose, seems to be that its popularity has declined. It's not being discussed as much or as widely. But is that true? Has its popularity declined? Is it actually increasing?
The popularity is absolutely increasing. And the reason that people get tricked is that they watch the price and they use the price of Bitcoin as the only metric by which they assess its success. And the Bitcoin price has gone through 3 or 4 large bubbles where it's appreciated by 10x over the course of a couple months. And during those bubbles, the media catches on. They start writing stories about it. Everyone's talking about it. It's like this big thing. And then as with all financial speculative bubbles, at some point it pops and the price starts to decline and goes back down to a level that is uninteresting to anyone who's not involved in the industry. And at that point, the media stories stop. Some people start proclaiming that Bitcoin is dead. There's a website that's been tracking pronouncements of Bitcoin's death, and I think they're up to about 120 counts of Bitcoin being dead. But that's all just people being tricked by the price. What's a more valid metric is actual transaction volume. And since Bitcoin is an open source network, there's all sorts of really interesting data you can see about payments going around the world. And if you look at a chart of transaction quantity from the start of Bitcoin to now, it is the exact kind of exponential curve that you would want to see in a growing technology. So it is actually used this year more than last year and that year before the year prior, even though its price maxed out in late 2013.
All right. Well, that's interesting to know, and that definitely seems to counter the common narrative out there about the use of Bitcoin and its popularity. And one other aspect of Bitcoin's popularity I want to touch on before we talk about what's been going on with Bitcoin recently and where it might be headed, and we wrap up here. Bitcoin, for some reasons that we've discussed so far, has been especially popular among libertarians, and again, amongst those who have been skeptical of central banks, of the U.S. Federal Reserve, of fiat currency, of the dollar, of the euro, things of that nature. How does popularity amongst libertarians and other skeptics of the current system of central banks and fiat money, how does that popularity compare with popularity of Bitcoin throughout the rest of society?
So the libertarian world was certainly one of the early adopters, although there was a lot of initial skepticism from that community. And I'm from that community. I learned about Bitcoin through a friend in the Free State Project in New Hampshire. And when I got involved in 2011, I quite quickly became a complete maniac for Bitcoin, and I was telling everyone about it and trying to show everyone how important this was. And probably for about a year, there was a lot of skepticism from libertarians. Not everyone, but many. And they sort of took the position that gold wasn't just a better form of money than dollars, but that gold was the best and only form of money. And I felt like that was a flawed opinion. I could clearly see objectively that Bitcoin worked better as a form of money than gold did. Even though I agreed with them that gold was far superior to fiat. And I also tried to explain that like the two were not really competitors. They were great complements to anyone who values liberty. You know, gold is far more stable than Bitcoin. It has been around far longer. It has many properties that are different than Bitcoin. It is physical, where Bitcoin is digital. And it's for saving wealth. I mean, it would be much more advisable to save wealth in gold than Bitcoin because of the volatility. And so I think as people started realizing that a gold plus Bitcoin combination was a really attractive mix, they started opening up more to it. And at this point, most libertarians are quite interested and excited by Bitcoin, and I don't think it's nearly as controversial as it was.
And how does the popularity among libertarians compare to that among non-libertarians? Just how popular is it among non-libertarians?
Well, it's still very small and nascent. So, most people on the street, many people on the street have heard of Bitcoin at this point. Most people still have never used it and have very little understanding of what it is. So it's still very, very small. A lot of the people who are getting involved now are not necessarily ideologically driven, but they're business people that see the opportunity in the fact that there's an entire new industry springing up. Just as the internet allowed the transfer of information for free around the world, and that totally changed how everyone lives their lives, and it was a huge business opportunity. Bitcoin is very much the same, because now value can move around the world, just as information did. And there's all sorts of interesting new opportunities. There will be lots of businesses that get disrupted and displaced and changed, and brand new ways of interacting with each other that people are starting to build. So at this point, I think it's left its sort of libertarian roots and is getting adopted in wider and wider circles, which is good. I mean, the whole point was not just for a money for libertarians to use, but a better form of money for the entire world.
Right, absolutely. Now, shifting to the last few months or so, what have been some of the recent events and concerns that have come up related to Bitcoin?
Anyone in the Bitcoin industry over the last year will tell you that the biggest issue is what's known as the block size debate, which is a little arcane to someone who isn't involved in Bitcoin heavily, but it's essentially a technological debate about how large blocks should be, which means how many transactions can fit into a block. And right now, these blocks, which are every 10 minutes, are 1 megabyte, and that allows sort of a maximum of about 7 transactions per second on the whole network, which is not nearly enough for a global financial system. So the debate has been how and whether and on what time frame to increase that block size and what consequences that might have. And it's become sort of needlessly divisive, and the community has broken pretty strongly into two camps: those who don't want to increase the size or want to do it very slowly and conservatively much later on, and those who think there's an urgent need to do it right now. And it's become sort of a bitter civil war within the industry.
Yeah, infighting seems to be at the core of a lot of the recent news around Bitcoin, but do you have any idea how this will be resolved?
I don't. I wish I did. But I mean, it has to be understood in the context of the cryptocurrency industry more broadly, which is more than Bitcoin at this point. If the people involved in building the actual protocol level of Bitcoin are wrong in what they do, then another cryptocurrency could come along and start taking its place, and people will use that. So it'll be resolved in the way that anything in a marketplace is resolved by people ultimately making decisions with their own time and money. And I'm hopeful that Bitcoin will maintain its lead and its large position in the ecosystem, but that's not guaranteed. And I think people need to be very careful about decisions they make with its development.
Yeah, do you see any emerging competitors that could overtake Bitcoin? Is there anything on the horizon that could surpass it? And what changes do you anticipate being made in Bitcoins to compete with a potential competitor?
So most people would point to Ethereum, which is another blockchain project, as being a competitor. It is in some ways a competitor to Bitcoin, but in my personal opinion, I think it's actually more complementary. It is not just a different brand of money, but it is a very differently architected type of blockchain that allows some very advanced functionality. And currently it allows a higher transaction throughput than Bitcoin. And so if that's the main pain point, people might start using Ethereum as money more than they do Bitcoin. But I think those two systems have a very good future together. I think each one makes the other one more valuable because they each have different strengths. And ultimately, I don't see them as direct competitors. But there's 500 cryptocurrencies at this point, and lots of money to be made by people who build one of these systems. Own a bunch of the early tokens, and then as it gets used more broadly, the value of the tokens goes up. So there's a profit incentive in always trying to outcompete and outdo the other.
Okay, so one final question. What predictions do you have for where the popularity of Bitcoin is headed, as well as changes we may see in Bitcoin? And where do you think the overall popularity of cryptocurrencies in general is headed?
Well, the recent thing over the last 6 or 12 months has been the change in the discussion from being about Bitcoin to being about blockchain. And blockchain is, of course, the technology that underlies Bitcoin, but it can be used in ways that are separate from Bitcoin. And many financial institutions are seeing that technology and realizing that there is massive potential in it. Whether or not that means utilizing Bitcoin specifically in some way or not is a separate question, but they're getting very excited about the blockchain technology in general. And so most of the attention right now is on the big institutions that are getting involved in researching blockchain technology. Even like the British government put up a £10 million fund to study this stuff, and every major financial institution and bank is looking into it. So this stuff is very much having like a moment of large industry players getting involved. And I think, a year or two from now, we'll see what the results of that were and what the consequences were, for better or worse.
All right. Well, it will be very interesting to follow, of course, and we'll see where this is headed. I don't think any of us really have a sense of where this is all headed, but it'll definitely be interesting to watch and observe.
Yeah, it's all a big crazy experiment still.
Yeah, no, and that makes it all the more exciting, of course. So I want to thank you for joining me today. For someone who is relatively new to the sorts of things we've been discussing today, what do you recommend they read? And even for someone who's more advanced, what do you recommend they check out as well?
To get started, Bitcoin.com is a pretty good place to go. I would say, importantly, this isn't a topic that you can learn about reading one article. You really need to set aside a few hours to read lots of things and learn about it from different perspectives. It has social ramifications, it has economic ramifications, it has technological ramifications, and all these moving parts sort of interoperate in interesting ways. It's absolutely something that people should learn about and be familiar with and understand. And one of the best ways to do that is just to get some. Go buy $10 worth of Bitcoin, put it on your phone, and send some to your friend. You'll see how it works, and you'll see how it's different than a credit card or a PayPal. And until you've actually tried that, just like, riding a bike or driving a car, you can't really understand it until you've felt it in that way. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, sure. And in addition to Bitcoin.com, are there any other resources you would recommend?
Probably too many to count. I mean, Coindesk.com is a really good site for news about the industry. Although for anyone who's brand new to Bitcoin, a lot of that stuff might not be relevant yet. There's some good movies. I mean, The Rise and Rise of Bitcoin, which I think is on Netflix at this point, is a great documentary about the sort of early days of Bitcoin and how it got started. There's a great book called Digital Gold by New York Times author Nathaniel Popper, which is excellent. So there's some very good ways to sort of dive in deep in the stuff.
Okay, great. And what are the best ways to follow your work?
So Twitter is probably a great way to do it. It's at Erik Voorhees. And I don't know, you'll probably see my name pop up in the industry from time to time because I'm fairly outspoken about these kind of topics. But yeah, my company is shapeshift.io. It's a digital asset exchange, so a way to convert between these different cryptocurrencies. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, great. Well, I want to encourage everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Bitcoin-future. That's the show notes page for this episode. And of course, we'll link to shapeshift.io, and we'll link to the at Erik Voorhees Twitter account. And we'll link to Digital Gold and Coindesk.com, Bitcoin.com, all the resources and links that we've been discussing today. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Bitcoin-future is the place to go for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're there to sign up for our email list so that they can stay up to date with what's going on with the show. And also to follow us on Twitter at WUC Podcast is the handle for that, at WUC Podcast. And on that note, Erik, thank you for joining me today. I know there was a lot to cover, and I was trying to mix in some basic topics with some objections and maybe some more advanced things.
That was great.
It's there's a lot to go through, and it can be overwhelming for someone who's new, and I'm still relatively new to this, so it's overwhelming for me. So I'm glad we're able to cover as much ground as we could today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, and I'd love to speak with you again sometime soon.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.